From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. The US is involved in no end of complex crises around the world. But what about the self-inflicted one at home?
On the morning and the afternoon of April the 9th, so morning and afternoon London time, I remember being at my desk and having a weird, is this the beginning of the end moment?
Something really funky happened in the bond market, which is, what's been happening since the tariffs were announced is people bought bonds. They went into safe haven bonds, they bet on recession, and yields went down. Guess what started happening yesterday? The opposite.
Because I was looking at my screens, which all show big financial lines, and they were all going up, and they were all showing this extreme movements in government borrowing costs for the US.
The bond market crash right now does not seem normal. And I'm starting to think there's something at play that is bigger than everything else, meaning there's somebody dumping bonds massively.
Do we have to worry about foreigners selling our bonds?
This was exactly the kind of dynamic that followed the mini budget in the UK. So we had this big fiscal moment in the UK. Our government borrowing costs went completely haywire. There were all these reports from the City of London that financial institutions are dumping government debt because they need to raise emergency cash. We're having fire sales. Something was breaking in the financial system. And that's what it felt like on the day of April 9th.
All of this has got to do with America's black Amex card with the bottomless overdraft being pulled, and they get an ordinary, plain, bog standard blue one with a much tighter credit limit to live with it.
And it felt like that up until around 8 p.m. when we started to get rumors from the US that actually Donald Trump was going to announce a pause on the tariffs that were causing all of this volatility. And then a couple of hours later, it was around 10 p.m., we get confirmation that the level of anxiety in the bond market had actually forced the president into a tactical retreat. He then announces a 90-day pause for most countries.
Was it the bond markets that persuaded you to reverse course?
I was watching the bond market. The bond market is very tricky. I was watching it, but if you look at it now, it's beautiful. The bond market right now is beautiful. I saw last night where people were getting a little queasy.
But we still don't really understand and have no certainty of the future of tariff policy post the 90-day window. And to make it all more complicated, we've also had an important court judgment, which I would describe as something of a bombshell.
We're following some very big breaking news tonight, news that will come as a big blow to Donald Trump and his agenda. Tonight, a 3-judge panel in New York has effectively balked almost all of Trump's disastrous tariffs.
Clinging on throughout all of this has been the dollar. It's fallen 9% since the start of this year, its worst year since 2008, and we all know what happened there. US assets have been the safest of havens for decades, but is that all about to change?
So that morning and afternoon of April the 9th was the first time I think people like myself who cover these things and traders who have to trade US assets were thinking for the first time, has the rest of the world lost confidence in US assets, in particular the dollar?
The story today, why the dollar is crashing and why you should care.
My name is Mehreen Khan. I'm the economics editor at The Times.
So in the long fallout of Trump's Liberation Day and all of these tariffs announced and then unannounced or delayed, the full hokey-cokey, we've now had the courts involved, and they have said what to Donald Trump?
So very surprisingly, on Wednesday, the 28th of May, overnight in the UK, the US Trade Court, which has federal powers, basically decided they were adjudicating over 2 cases brought by some companies in the US and a few states in the US who had argued that Trump's tariffs were illegal. And unexpectedly to, I think, most people, the court actually decided that, yes, most of the tariffs that have been announced by the president have been deemed invalidated because he does not have the power, the unilateral executive power, to impose tariffs on basically every single country in the world, which is what he's done. Now, in the broad scheme, what that means is that in the next 10 days, the government has been given a deadline to dismantle all of the border infrastructure that it's put in place, to refund the tariffs that it's been applying to countries like Mexico and Canada since February, because they're arguing, and it is a technicality, that the emergency powers that Donald Trump has evoked are not appropriate for tariffs. That he has been given too much executive power by Congress, which has delegated him this power to be able to apply tariffs on these countries. And most of the tariffs, so if we take out tariffs on steel, aluminium and cars, which stay in place, all the other tariffs, which is basically everything else, those are no longer deemed to be legal in the eyes of the court. And they have asked the Trump administration to step back.
And the Trump administration have said...
The immediate response of the administration has been, we will challenge this in court, that the Federal Trade Court, is undermining US democracy because judges do not have the right to decide what a president is or isn't allowed to do, because that's not how democracy works. So we've had the kind of, I think, the classic sort of, knee-jerk reaction from the Trump administration to say everything we are doing is legal. But I think it's important that the court judgment is important because it shows a difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2, because this administration came into office and said basically overnight, when we come in, we're going to use executive powers to do tariffs in an unprecedented manner. This is not really what the Economic Emergencies Powers Act was supposed to be used for. But in Trump 1, they took their time. So they used the right legal frameworks to impose things like tariffs on China, and they were never challenged in the court. So this kind of shows the sort of roughshod nature of what Trump 2 is, which is why we're getting all these legal challenges mounting up. And I think actually the decision of the court, let's see how it sort of shakes out. But I think for now, this is incredibly, incredibly significant.
Which, if I'm the dollar, with all that happened on Liberation Day, with this being caught up in the court, I can feel my blood pressure rising. We've also got an enormous bill making its way through Congress, which is going to add a lot to the debt. Is that right? And how much might this be stressing out the dollar?
So the dollar has taken on a lot of the anxiety around the state of Trump's economic policies. And you're right, this judgment comes at a really important time. One, when the big, beautiful budget bill, which would add trillions and trillions onto the US budget deficit.
And that's Trump's name for it, not necessarily just yours.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm only quoting. Sorry, I should do my accent, I guess, when I should do it.
Yeah, do the voice.
I'm too embarrassed. It will come to me. So his budget bill, which is probably, after tariffs, the landmark kind of economic policy goal of this administration is to get this huge fiscal bill passed through the House and through Congress. It's happening at the same time as this sort of bombshell lands from the courts. And they are connected. One, because I think it's important for the listeners to realize that tariffs is about trade and protectionism, but it also generates lots of money for the US government. And by some estimates, if the tariffs were to go ahead, the US government would be generating $350 to $400 billion a year
at least in the short
levies.
term.
In year one, let's say. And that $300 to $400 billion, a lot of money by anyone's standards, was going to be used to pay for the tax cuts in the big, beautiful bill. Right? So there's a direct connection that all the money we get through the tariffs, we're going to use that to pay for the tax cuts. They are very much linked. If the tariffs are completely now under question, then that will also, I think, throw this bill and the progress of this bill into turmoil.
Yes, because they are enormous, the amounts of tax cuts being promised in that bill. I mean, what's it going to add to the debt, roughly, do you think?
I think neutral objective estimates, the big budget bill would add up to $6 to $7 trillion onto the deficit. The deficit is probably going to be hitting closer to 7 to 8 percentage points of GDP. And that's with the implication of the tariff revenues coming in. So without that, these numbers could just go to the moon. And the reason we're talking about the dollar is that if you can no longer, a bit like a Liz Truss kind of moment, if you can no longer trust the fiscal sustainability of the country issuing the currency, the US, then why the hell would you want to own the US dollar or US asset?
And is that why I should care here in the UK or anywhere in the world?
Well, I guess in a super consumery, like basic sense, why should you care about the value of the dollar? Well, one, because the pound, its value is measured against other currencies, one of the big ones being the dollar. So if you were planning to go to the US, if you can get in, you would have much more purchasing power, right? So Brits have experienced an 8% rise in the value of sterling against the US dollar. So I was in the US a couple of weeks ago and my money was going a bit further than it had done in previous years.
Back to Disney World.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, everything's still very expensive in any normal objective sense. But so the currency movements will actually just affect the currency, our currency, the pound. And then the other sense, I guess, we're going to be talking about is that if there is some fundamental break in the dollar system, so I'm calling the world that we've been living in probably for the last half century the dollar standard, right? The monetary regime we live in is dominated by the dollar at its center. If that fundamental asset that runs global finance and the world economy is no longer at the center of everything we do in our transactions, that means this monetary system is breaking, and that means we're going into something else. I don't know what the something else is, but if this is the end of the dollar standard, then, there's a potential world of pain that is coming our way.
A world of pain. Okay, before we get to that, when you say we've been living in a dollar world, the dollar is the global reserve currency, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, we use this term reserve currency a lot. I think in a really basic sense, it just means that you have the currency that everybody in the world wants to own. And they want to own it because they think it's super safe. It's the safest form of asset. If I'm worried about the world, I don't know what I want to do with my cash. I don't want to put it under the bed because inflation is too high and gold's too expensive. I put it in the dollar, I park it in the dollar because the dollar is underwritten by the world's biggest economy, the US, the world's biggest military power, the US, and generally a country that has behaved in a way that hasn't given us too many reasons to worry about it. I mean, you can question lots of things about how the US is, domestic policy, fiscal policy, but ultimately it has the rule of law, the strong institutions, the economic growth, and it is the world's hegemon, and it underwrites the value of the dollar. So it's not a bad thing to hold. And actually, when most things go bad in the world, people buy the dollar, even if those bad things are actually generated by the US. That's the unique, weird privilege that you get from having a reserve currency.
And not just people, countries, central banks will hold the dollar
yes,
as well.
Exactly. Central banks hold the dollar because they think it's a good thing to have, a bit like gold. It's safe. And they also, if they want to engage in some, let's say, currency manipulation, as in they want to manipulate the value of their own currency, they can buy or sell dollars to be able to do that. So it gives them basically a bit of sovereignty over their own currencies as well.
Interesting, by owning bits of someone else's.
Yeah, if you sell the dollar, then you strengthen your own currency. If you buy the dollar, you weaken your own currency because currencies are measured in a bilateral sense. So when I say the pound against the dollar, the pound against the euro, that's how we sort of think about currencies in these like exchange rate terms with another currency. And often the currency that everyone bases their value of their own currency against is the dollar because it's the world's reserve. And one of the features of a reserve currency is that it's completely escaped the control of the US government and the US president of the day. The dollar is issued by the US, but it is the world's currency because it has become such an important asset in the financial system. And the reason that Trump is having so many problems with the value of the currency is because he can no longer control it. And that's been true, I think, for a few decades now.
What is the benefit for the American at the centre of all of this? Are there benefits for them and their economy?
Right. So Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who was a French president in the 80s, termed this phrase called the exorbitant privilege of having the world's reserve currency. Because if you were French or European, you looked at the Americans and they're basically living it up. They've got the world's reserve currency, which means that the currency is incredibly strong, which means Americans have fantastic purchasing power, which is why... Hint, spoiler, this is why they import so much stuff, right? They have the ability to impose financial sanctions on countries, as we saw happen with Russia in 2022 and has happened with other countries. If you control the asset that runs the global financial system, you are able to exert incredible amounts of power over other countries, over other businesses, over people that you want to do deals with. This is the privilege that you get from having the world's reserve currency, and Americans and American presidents and American governments have enjoyed that privilege. However, if you ask the Trump administration, they eschew all of these privileges and say, nope, you're wrong. Having the world's reserve currency is an incredible burden around our neck. They talk about the exorbitant burden of having the world's reserve currency, which is why they're unhappy with the strong currency, and it's why they want a weaker dollar. There you go.
Mehreen, you're taking us through, well, a lot of things that have happened in the United States at the moment, but what that has meant for the dollar, which, as you said a moment ago, isn't really the American currency anymore. The US government issues it, but it is the world's currency. It is in this incredible position where so many countries' financial systems rely on it and use it. And yet you said there that the White House, Donald Trump, would like to see a weaker dollar. Why?
In a really basic sense, this current US administration thinks that having a world's reserve currency has been a terrible burden on the US because the strength of that currency, they would argue, has basically wiped out American manufacturing and has stopped making the US into an exporting powerhouse. Now, why is that the case? And it's a kind of just a simple arithmetic issue. When you have a very strong currency, if you're selling stuff, American cars, to the rest of the world, if those cars are valued in dollars, but I've only got pounds, but the dollar is incredibly strong, it makes me buying or importing American stuff very expensive. Just makes it really expensive. It makes it hyper uncompetitive. And in the Trumpian worldview, the strength of the dollar has been basically uniquely responsible for ensuring the uncompetitiveness of American exports. And that uncompetitiveness has meant that other countries have taken advantage of it. China, which has a much weaker currency, and the destruction of American manufacturing, which has also led to the destruction of manufacturing jobs, of industrial workers in the US. All of this stuff Trump thinks has been the US economic policymakers and various governments kind of dropping the ball. So when he is promising to restore the golden age of America, which is what he says tariffs will do, it's basically about giving Americans more factory jobs. That's what the golden age looks like to him.
But do you buy the whole argument put forward that one of the reasons why so many of those jobs have left the United States and gone to places like China and Vietnam is because the currency is very strong, as opposed to other factors like China and Vietnam having enormous, very low-paid workforces and other bits like that?
So those things are actually connected. And they're connected in a sense of, without getting, how do I do this without getting too wonky?
Try,
They're
mate.
connected in the sense of what Trump talks about when he talks about rebalancing the world economy. So why are wages in China and Vietnam and Bangladesh and Mexico so cheap? Because those countries have pursued a certain type of economic model which suppresses domestic labor and suppresses domestic consumption. So it means that the people in those countries just can't afford to buy that much stuff because they prioritize this idea of selling stuff to the rest of the world. They prioritize the export model. Now, the US hasn't done that. The US, partly through a very strong currency, has helped stoke domestic demand. So Americans have huge purchasing power. They buy stuff. A lot of that stuff is also from abroad. And they've ran an economic model which is based around investment and consumption. So this administration talks about the rebalancing of the global economy, which is about China exporting less and consuming more at home, and the US exporting more and consuming less. And you don't really have to be a Trumpian to admit that this is a problem. The Chinese problem of underconsumption and the American problem of over-indebtedness are both unsustainable for both those countries. And they're both generating domestic political problems in those countries because they're pursuing such extreme economic policies.
And in China, they're trying to stoke consumption and get people spending more, not so successfully. On the US side of things, is it right then to try and devalue the dollar? Is that what they're trying to do? And I don't know, will they be successful?
So how does the America rebalance in this world? So you've described the Chinese problem is how to develop more of a consumer power, and you can argue whether they want to do it or not, but let's put that to a side. If you want to achieve economic rebalancing in the US and you're the US president, there are two things you probably need to do. One, become competitive, so having a weaker dollar. But the other one is that to reduce your consumption, and that actually implies massive amounts.
Have you met Americans?
Well, what does it imply? For the fiscal budget, it implies austerity. Right? It implies a radical shrinking of the size of fiscal spending, of federal government spending. And that has to be on defense spending, it has to be on social care spending, it has to be on everything. And the problem with the big budget, beautiful budget bill is that it's doing no austerity at all. It's massively fiscally expansionary. So the US is actually playing its role in this rebalancing debate, because if we really want to take rebalancing seriously, the US has to go on an incredibly painful austerity shock, right? Worse than the one that the UK has been through for the last 10 years, if it's serious about imbalancing, because it needs a much, much smaller deficit and a far less burdensome debt pile.
What about the less painful sounding option of weakening the dollar? How would you do that?
Well, it's kind of happening already, right? So is it a less painful option? Well, in some senses, yes. Trump thinks it is a less painful option. Actually, he does. What's happening right now is that the dollar is weakening because people are selling the dollar. And you could probably argue, well, that's great. Trump has achieved everything he's wanted to achieve. With the massive caveat that this is exactly what shouldn't be happening right now. So if you told anyone on April the 1st, April Fool's Day, that Donald Trump was going to announce tariffs the next day, they'd be like, okay, so the dollar's going to strengthen in value. That is the textbook thing that was supposed to happen, and I'll explain why. Two reasons. One, if the US imposes tariffs on the rest of the world, they're basically cutting themselves off from global trade, and Americans are going to be buying less stuff from the rest of the world. If Americans are buying less stuff from the rest of the world, there is a smaller supply of dollars in the rest of the world. So it's a supply-demand thing. Less supply, value of the dollar will go up. And the other one is the reserve currency status means that if there's something really terrible about to happen, like massive amounts of tariffs, everyone is really scared in the financial markets. So when they're scared, what do? They buy dollars. So the dollar goes up. So after the financial crisis, which was started by, mis-selling of American financial products in Wall Street, what happens? The dollar goes up. We're worried about the pandemic, the dollar goes up. So there's always this flight to safety thing that the dollar always benefits from. And that's the reserve currency part of it. That's the exorbitant privilege of that. Every time something's bad, people buy your currency.
Even if it's American made.
Even if you're the reason it's all bad.
Yeah.
But this time, neither of those things has happened. The dollar has been weakening, and that's why we're talking about a dynamic that I last saw when Liz Truss was in power. What is the Liz Truss effect? Your currency weakens and your bond prices also go down. Usually when your bond prices are falling, your currency will strengthen. It's kind of mechanical reaction.
Bond prices being?
Bond prices being the cost of government borrowing. So when the price of the bond goes down, the yield on the bond goes up, and the yield is effectively the borrowing cost for a government. So right now, the US government's borrowing costs are becoming very, very expensive, and its currency is also falling. That is the Liz Truss dynamic. The reason I was getting flashbacks to the mini budget moment was the parallels were kind of incredibly opposite. So you had a completely ideologically driven politician, the then prime minister and now the US president, that was pursuing an economic policy that most people agreed was completely mad. And the immediate reaction of financial markets was to trade the assets of that country in a particular way. One was by selling the debt, so selling the government bonds of the country. So that happened with UK gilts, it was happening with US treasuries, and to also sell the currency at the same time. And so when the bonds fall in price and the currencies are falling, that's the kind of, when you're in what used to be called the moron premium, that's the credibility crisis dynamic that you see in financial markets. We don't want to hold on to their debt,
we don't want their currency,
hot potatoes,
we don't want
drop
any
it.
part of it.
Yeah, drop it. But the fundamental tension at the heart of the Trump administration is that he wants a weaker currency to help exporters and to regain manufacturing prowess, but he doesn't want to lose the reserve status that the dollar has held since 1971.
Which sound mutually exclusive.
Right. Which also explains why everything that he's doing seems to be completely incoherent. Now, the problem with the idea that you can have a weaker currency but keep the reserve status is that there is probably a world in which you can do that, but that world requires Donald Trump to be a completely different kind of person. So there's lots of ways in which Trump is like Nixon in 1971, this kind of incredibly aggressive unilateral moment, which we now call the Nixon shock, which I spoke about in my Gold episode. He goes on TV and he basically tells the rest of the world, this is my currency. I've decided that I'm going to change the system. The rest of you lot are just going to have to work it out between yourselves. But it would probably be better if Trump was like Reagan, which is a president he invokes a lot. I mean, he's not quite...
The showman.
Yeah, exactly.
Likes a tan.
Good hair. So Reagan in 1981 also has a dollar problem. The dollar's very strong because US interest rates have been going mad for nearly a decade, and he's got American producers and American farmers and American manufacturers on his back, and they're like, you got to weaken the currency, right? We're becoming super uncompetitive. So what Reagan does is he gathers his mates, i.e. the world's also biggest economies at that point, the United States, France, Germany, but mainly Japan, and he brings them to the Plaza Hotel in New York, which weirdly enough was owned by Trump for a few years. Yeah.
Fun fact.
Yeah, I know, fun fact. And he sits down with them and, he kind of does a politician to politician thing, being like, I got a dollar problem, you guys have got to help me out. So the way that in the Plaza Accord, they agreed to a managed depreciation of the dollar by getting all the other countries around the table to appreciate their own currencies, so to strengthen their own currencies. And the main economy that Reagan needs this to happen in is Japan. So Japan is a bit like China is today. It is the emerging Asian economy that is developing huge manufacturing prowess, which is potentially rivaling and even outstripping the US, right? So Japan has become a problem. And at the Plaza Accord, they do a deal. They agree to a managed depreciation of the dollar by appreciating other currencies. So the pound, the German Deutschmark, the French franc, but mainly the Japanese yen will appreciate in response. And actually the appreciation of the yen in the years after 1981 is incredibly strong. Japan ends up having a fantastically overvalued currency, which massively hurts its economy and probably was the beginning of the Japanese economic decline, which we're still living with today. Now, Reagan could do that because he had very credible economic advisors who could kind of sit down and say, we need to do this for bigger geopolitical reasons. But this is just not the way that Trump does diplomacy, as we've realized. He doesn't get people around to Mar-a-Lago, sit around a table and say, guys, let's do a deal. The good deal is good for me, it's good for you. He kind of just sees the world in this sort of zero-sum game where I win, you lose. I think what's happening right now is the dollar is weakening because people are losing faith in the US as the underwriter of the world's reserve currency, and the reserve status, that privileged status that the US has held for so long, the dollar's held, is actually being eroded by the chaos of the Trump administration. So yes, he's weakening the dollar, but in the worst possible way, by also casting off the reserve status that the dollar has held.
So say he's thrashing through all of this in a very unmanaged way, and the world has less and less patience, especially when the dollar, as you've explained, is so intrinsic to trade and transactions around the world. Is there a point where, realistically, dollar hegemony, dollar being the reserve currency, ends?
Sure. I mean, the history of monetary economics is that, there are no certainties, there's no guarantees. It's a bit like the Roman Empire, right? Everything can fall.
It's been a good,
it's
almost
been a pretty
century.
Decent run. Yeah.
Just over a century.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At least half a century. It's been not too bad. The dollar standard, you could say, has had, fantastic benefits for Americans to some degree, and also has hurt a lot of Americans too. But yes, we can see a world in which the dollar is no longer the central driving part of global economics and finance. But the reason I kind of hesitate to say, yeah, sure, it will happen, is that, well, what replaces it? A couple of days before we're speaking, Christine Lagarde, who is the president of the European Central Bank, does this speech where she says, now is the euro's moment. So she's saying, oh, that dollar thing, you don't want dollars. You should have euros. The euro should become the world's reserve currency. If we don't no longer trust the US, we don't no longer trust the currency, then it's clear we have a ready-made replacement in the euro. Now, in some ways,
not immune to crises, the euro.
Wow, that's a very good point. And of course, in some ways, you kind of expect that. But let's be honest. There are many reasons why. There are many characteristics you need to have to become the world's reserve currency, right?
Yeah.
The most important economy in the eurozone is Germany, and Germany is basically the China of Europe. They deliberately underconsume, they suppress their wages, and they don't issue debt. So actually getting hold of euro-denominated assets like German bonds is very difficult because there are no German bonds in the market, right? They're a scarce asset. So if the euro wants to become the world's reserve currency, they have to become more like the US and less like China. And I don't think the Europeans are really ready to kind of embrace that model. The other one, people say, well, the Chinese renminbi will become the world's reserve currency. And
Bitcoin.
And Bitcoin or stable coins or some kind of, acronym that we've never heard of will become part of, the kind of messy world of monetary economics. And the other one, and whisper it, but people talking about, well, let's just go back to gold. If we can't agree that we don't trust fiat currencies anymore, and we don't kind of trust crypto because it's so volatile and it's become, plagued by the fact that it's just like the chosen currency of the world's bad people and criminals, then why not just go back to gold? If we all agree that the shiny metal is actually the thing that really we derive value from, and when we spoke about gold, I sort of told you that more and more people think this is the case, well, let's just reconstruct the gold system again. So bizarrely enough, in 2025, these are real conversations that are being had. And that's because the current monetary order is coming under the biggest amount of stress that it's ever come under, the dollar standard. And so we are going to have to work out what comes next. And whatever comes after Trump, I think it would be hard for them to argue that the US has not suffered from the thing called the China shock. And Donald Trump is probably not going to manage this rebalancing in any way that's not completely cack-handed and completely self-destructive. But are there better ways to design a monetary system to prevent these imbalances getting worse? Yeah, I think there are. I'm still struck by, a couple of weeks ago, I was in DC where Rachel Reeves, the UK Chancellor, stood up in front of a mainly American crowd at the British Embassy, and she said, the UK needs to rebalance its economy. We cannot keep going on the way we have been going on. And, you could say maybe she's just being cynical. She's just saying that because she wants to get in Trump's good books. But if this penny is dropping among people in the UK, in Canada, in Germany, and China, that we need to change the way the world economy has been running, because these imbalances are hurting our economies, but they're also hurting people. They're hurting our politics. They're making politics more extreme. They're hurting the social contract, all those kind of things. Then yes, I think the story of the dollar still has many, many chapters to go.
Mehreen Khan, economics editor at The Times. There is plenty more from her at thetimes.com if you've got a subscription. And if you missed the excellent episode we did with her on gold, we'll put a link to that episode in the description. This episode was produced by Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Molly Guinness, and sound design and theme composition were by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.